Shalom, friends. We will start. Shana Tova, Gmar Tov. I hope the high holidays have been meaningful, and I will now mute all and look forward to an interactive webinar. It's good to see our partners online. This is a webinar in a series that we are offering by Chidush. Chidush is the Hebrew acronym, for those who are not familiar as yet, of Chofesh Dat V'Shivyon, freedom of religion and equality. So Chidush is our Israel Diaspora Partnership for freedom of religion in Israel. And we are holding those webinars in partnership with Ruach Chidush, Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom and Equality in Israel. We are fortunate to have quite a number of rabbis and members in this webinar. J-Plan, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and I see Peter Buxbaum and Mark Enshen and possibly more. Peter and Mark are co-chairs of J-Plan, and we certainly would love to hear from you if you are lawyers, if you have lawyers in your family, if you have labor and lawyer neighbors who are interested in Israel and in religious freedom. We would love to include you in the fold, and the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. This webinar will focus on a new publication of Chidush, the 2020 Israel Religion and State Index, the only one of its kind in-depth review of Israeli public opinion, adult Jewish public opinion, regarding all matters of religion and state. We have started doing it when we founded Chidush, and it's wonderful to Stanley Gold, who was my main partner and ally and leader in founding Chidush back in 2009 and to this very day. So when we founded Chidush, we founded it as a Israel Diaspora Partnership. And as you will soon see, the questions that we ask involve both how Israelis feel domestically and how they feel about engagement of Jewish leadership from the diaspora in pursuing those issues of religion and state in Israel. We sent you initially, for those of you, and I assume possibly all of you who have received our newsletter, you saw a link to the full report, and in the follow-up email in which we will provide you with a link to the recording of this webinar, will also include a link to the report, and we urge you to take advantage of it, share it, etc. And before we started, I mentioned to those who are already online, and I'll stress it now, I've enlisted the help of my wife, Gary, in order to make this webinar even more interactive than we did before, because I'm really looking forward to being able to not only present you with the findings of the annual survey on matters of religion and state, but to be able to respond to your interests and to be able to explain things that may not be as clear to you as they may be to us here who are working on it for a long time now. So use the chat, ask your questions, and make your comments, and my wife will break into the webinar when there are a number of questions, and I'll try to respond to them. And as I said, I look forward to an interactive session with you. So the first thing that we need to understand when we are talking about Israelis is that there is a distinct difference between how Israelis define themselves politically and how they define themselves religiously. In the Israel Religion and State Index that we hold, that we conduct through a leading polling agency in Israel, the Rafi Smith Institute, we are basing the survey on an expanded representative sample of the adult Jewish population. Usually such surveys are done with a sample of 500. We use a larger sample of 800 in order to have a better sampling of the subgroups that Israeli society, Israeli Jewish society is made up of. And the first thing that one needs to understand, and without understanding that, we really do not understand many of the things that may sound to some on the call, on this webinar, to be strange, because they don't fit the pattern that you may be considering appropriate for Israel. When it comes to political outlook, for some years now, and I want to stress this has not been the case historically, and this may not be the case in the future. But for some years now, when you ask Israelis, where do you place yourselves on the political spectrum? And the option we give are very right, right, center leaning right, center, center leaning left, left and very left. The reality is that only 14%, and this isn't just our survey, many other surveys show comparable results, only 14% place themselves left of center, whereas some 65% place themselves right of center. In this survey, we have 66%. So 66% right of center, only 14% left of center. We won't go very deep into these questions, but I think we need to understand that in order to understand how come the results of Israeli elections are the way they are. For some, the question is, how come the left is not able to regain dominance in Israeli society, etc., etc. You see this breakdown and you understand much of the politics in Israel, and frankly, why the last elections, or the series of elections, the last 3 elections in Israel, were different than in some previous years. Because for the first time, with the appearance of blue and white, there was a contender for leadership that was not the left, but rather center and, to a great degree, right of center. It stood a chance that Labor and other left-wing parties did not have with this kind of breakdown of Israeli society in terms of politics. But having said that, what you see when you look at how Israelis define themselves religiously is a very, very different picture. Namely, and you see the graph, 47% secular, 18% traditional non-religious. Together, it makes up for some 65%, which hold a comparable view on public policy issues involving religion and state, as opposed to only 10% ultra-Orthodox and 11% modern Orthodox, Zionist Orthodox, and then sort of a middle group, traditional, tending toward religious, and we'll understand what the significance of those titles is very soon. So religiously, 2/3 are secular or traditional non-religious. Politically, 2/3 are on the right of center rather than the left. You think about that and you understand the gap between attitudes toward religious issues and attitudes toward political issues. Now, when you deal with the question of the correlation between political outlook and religious outlook, you see a very clear picture. Namely, there is a correlation between right-wing religiously and right-wing politically. 84% of the ultra-Orthodox, 73% of the modern Zionist Orthodox define themselves as very right or right. Whereas when you look at the secular, those that define themselves as secular, you see a much more nuanced breakdown, 23% right, 23% center right, 30% center, 24% center left. So to the extent that you ask yourselves, is there a correlation? Very much so. You are, the more right you move on the needle on the religious spectrum, the more right you are likely to place yourself on the political spectrum as well. Now, the other division, which is usually not asked in public opinion surveys and social studies, but we have asked, and occasionally the Israel, Central Bureau of Statistics and JPPI, the Jewish People's Public Policy Institute, etc., are asking, not the usual division of are you Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, religious, traditional, or secular, but what about the streams? When you ask about self-identification with the Jewish streams, what you see is a slightly different breakdown. You see, on the one hand, 60% of adult Israeli Jews who say, I'm not part of that scene. I don't identify with any streams. But among those who do identify with one of the religious streams, it's very important to understand that on the side of the 10% ultra-Orthodox, and those who identify, again, they may not be Orthodox themselves, but they align themselves, they identify with Zionist Orthodoxy or Zionist ultra-Orthodox, you find 19%. But the interesting thing is that after years of hearing again and again that for the average Israeli, the synagogue he doesn't go to has to be Orthodox, what you now see is an 11%, and that varies in different studies from, let's say, 10 to 13%. So here we see 11% who are saying, I identify myself, I align myself as Reform or Conservative. So 10% ultra-Orthodox, 11% Reform or Conservative. That's a very significant figure. Now, if we want to understand what's the correlation between these and politics, and I'll just mention, one thing, because basically we already saw. And here you see 84% of those who align with ultra-Orthodoxy are very right or right, 77% from those who align themselves with Zionist, 71% who align themselves with Zionist Orthodoxy, very right or right. But the interesting thing is, take a look at conservative and reform. And it's something that you may know anecdotally. Whereas reform tends to be divided pretty much, along the continuum, conservative Jews seem to be much more aligned with the right and right of center. Namely, 82% of those who identify with conservative Judaism place themselves right of center, whereas in the case of reform, there is more of a representation, more of self-identification with center and left of center. So it may interest you because, again, it may explain some of the public positions that are taken by the movements, especially in Israel, and where the reform movement finds itself politically when it takes political positions, and where conservative Judaism is, or rather isn't. Now, when we ask ourselves the question regarding Reform and Conservative, which I'm sure is of interest to many of you. How, where do we find people along the continuum that we mentioned before, namely ultra-Orthodox, Zionist, Orthodox, traditional religious, traditional not religious, or secular? And by the way, this division, these 5 categories of Jewish identity, was introduced by the Central Bureau of Statistics already about 15 years ago. Extremely helpful, as you will see in many of the findings that we are able to show. Unfortunately, the Pew Center, the Pew Institute, when they ran their landmark study of views of Israelis on religious issues, did not use this subdivision between 2 subgroups of those who identify themselves as traditional leaning toward religious, traditional leaning toward non-religious. They didn't, and I think their study lacks in this respect because it doesn't show this important nuance of a very significant sector in Israeli society. So, obviously, 96% of those who define themselves as ultra-Orthodox identify with ultra-Orthodox. But let's look at traditional religious, traditional non-religious, and secular. As you can see, most of the secular, 86%, say, I don't identify with any stream. Now, that's understandable. But 10% of secular Israelis say, I identify as Reform or with Reform. I align myself with Reform, compared to only 3% of secular Israelis who say, I align myself as conservative. Now, the numbers are small, so I wouldn't push this, this analysis too far, but it's consistent and it's indicative of what we know from other sources as well. When you look at traditional non-religious, you see a very different division. You see, on the one hand, 6% who are saying Reform, but 10% who are saying conservative. So conservative Judaism in Israel has more of a resonance in the traditional community. Reform Judaism resonates more with secular Israelis. The differences are not huge, but I think it should comfort us to realize that there are different sort of natural target populations that we can reach out to and draw from, and we don't necessarily have to, quarrel among ourselves on the same target group. Now, another major question is, of course, Israeli politicians will tell you Israel is a democracy. The way that Israelis run on religious issues is the way Israelis want it. Well, that's not quite so, as our consistent annual repeating survey will demonstrate to you. When you ask the question, do you support freedom of religion and conscience in Israel, taken in Hebrew from the text of the Declaration of Independence, and explaining that what we are talking about is freedom of choice and behavior for secular and religious people according to their outlooks, you see a consistent 83% who say, yes, we want freedom of religion and conscience. When you ask the question, do you support separation of religion and state, which I'm often asked about in America, isn't the solution separation of religion and state? Well, not according to the views of Israelis. Yes, there is an interesting growth, as you will see in a second, in support of separation, but still there is a significant 20% difference between the level of support in the principle of freedom of religion and conscience and the principle of separation of religion and state. Now, the bottom line may not be very different, but symbolically, psychologically, and sometimes legally, conceptually, they are different. Because in a separation of religion and state, you may find that you can't teach Bible in schools. You may find that you do not support, or you can't support, provision of religious services such as you do with regard to cultural services, sports, art, etc. Well, for Israelis, the notion of viewing the entitlement of people whose need is for religious services to be helped financially by the state, as people who are interested in sports or in the arts are supported by the state, is pretty high. So freedom of religion and conscience as a notion of a constitutional entitlement to make your own choices and not be coerced by the state, widely supported. Separation, yes, there is a majority support, but it is much smaller. Now, when you see this chart that shows you the difference in the different groups defined by their religious choice as to freedom of religion on the one hand and separation of religion and state on the other, you see a very clear picture. Namely, the secular, pretty close, 96% support freedom of religion, 89% of the seculars say, yes, bring it on, separation. Traditional non-religious, and already you can see the difference between the traditional non-religious that are much closer to the secular in terms of their views on public policy, and the traditional leaning toward religious that are closer to modern orthodoxy in terms of their public view. So traditional non-religious, 67% say, yes, we support separation, but only 31% of the traditional leaning toward religious, very close to the 29% of the modern Orthodox. And mind you, 29% of modern Orthodox say, yes, separation of religion and state is the way to go for Israel. And another interesting observation is that there is a 65% share of Zionist Orthodox who say freedom of religion is something I support. Now, granted, some of them may be thinking more of themselves than of fellow secular Jews or Reform or Conservative. But as a matter of principle, we see the high level of support and we see the difference. Now, let's see how the political arena reacts to the question of support of freedom of religion on the one hand and separation on the other. So Likud voters, 42% support separation, very close to 50%. But 82% of Likud say freedom of religion is something I am in favor of. Blue and white, listen, there is no question as to where blue and white constituency comes from, and you'll see more of it soon. So 95%, 87% say freedom of religion, separation. Same thing with Yesh Atid, which obviously will carry that flag high and proud in the next elections. Yamina is an interesting story because this is the breakdown according to current voting intentions. Now, Yamina is Naftali Bennett's party. And it has gone through a number of iterations. It used to be the successor to the Mafdal, to the National Religious Party. Yamina, as its name reflects, is a right-wing, staunch right-wing political party. But in terms of its religious makeup, it's no longer, overlapping those who define themselves as Zionist Orthodox. There are quite a number, and you will see it soon, secular and traditional Jews who hold right-wing political views who will vote for Yamina. And that's why we see a very high percentage, 77% of Yamina that say freedom of religion is something that Israel should be moving into, and even slightly more than half, 51%, who say, yes, separation is the way to go. Lastly, we included a column of undecided. And that's extremely important because, as you will see, some indications to what may we present in the next elections, which may happen sooner rather than later, as anyone who follows the news from Israel knows. So where should the contestants push? And what you will see consistently is that those who at this point say, I'm undecided as to whom to cast my vote for, are in favor of religious freedom. And as you will soon see, if the party that ran, that is close to their general political outlook in terms of security, in terms of the economy, were to present a strong religious freedom agenda, they are far more likely to get their vote. So note the undecided. They are on the same page as, I assume, all and certainly most of us on this call. Now, how important are those issues to Israelis? Because many will ask, well, you know, Israel has so many issues to cope with. Do they really care? And what we see from when we started the survey in 2009, now this presents the chart from 2011, but it really is pretty much the same. What we see is that the traditional conflicts, domestic conflicts in Israeli society, namely between Olim and Vatikim, new immigrants and veteran Israelis, and some of you, especially those who have known Israel over time, you know, intimately, closely, may remember this, you know, this sign that was associated with new immigrants from Russia. As soon as they came off the plane, they raised their hands and, you know, made this sign, not victory. Villa Volvo. This was associated with the new immigrants by a society that felt sort of, you know, deprived of some of the benefits that were given to the new immigrants. They were envious of them. And there was tremendous tension for a number of years between the new immigrants and veteran Israelis. Gone. All of that is something of the past. But even the two other conflicts that we know between rich and poor, and between Sfaradim and Ashkenazim, of Eastern descent and European descent of Jews, which has now been played out, again, for those who are following the news from Israel, played out by some interested parties that want to inflame this, this fire for a variety of interests. For most Israelis, these are conflicts of the past. They certainly do not rate high. The two high-rating domestic conflicts are between left and right, especially with a contentious approach that characterizes especially the leaders on the right. And clearly from the breakdown politically, it seems to have worked. They certainly were able to, you know, play their cards in a way that kept many Israelis both identified with and supportive of the political right, and negative is a mild word, feelings of hate, of demonization of the left. So with all of that, for a while, as you can see in 2012, 2013, 2011, it was a much more, you know, moderate, low priority conflict. But back in 2014, it has risen and kept rising and is now, you know, the red, the flame is ablaze. But the conflict between ultra-Orthodox and secular, which in many ways represents the conflict between religion and state, has also been consistently high, very close to the conflict between political left and political right. So if anyone is asking you, do Israelis really care? Tell them, oh, sure they do. This, in their view, and again, we are not comparing it to security. We are talking about domestic conflicts. This is a prime inflammatory conflict that is undermining the solidarity and the unity and the ability of Israeli society to move forward on a number of fronts. Well, back to the question of the streams that I know is of great interest to many of you, if not all. So we have been asking the question, what about equal recognition for the three major streams in Judaism? The picture is very clear, and it is quite consistent. So 65%, 2/3, and this is a figure that you will hear again and again, because on many of the religion and state issues, the division is 2-to-1. About 2/3 hold the position of pluralism, religious freedom, and equality, and about 1/3 are holding the counter position. So 65% are saying, yes, I greatly agree, or I somewhat agree with the statement that Israel should grant equal recognition to the three major streams in Judaism. Now, before I'm clobbered by those who may be on this call and say, well, what about Reconstructionists? What about renewal? Again, please understand, we are going to fight in the future, and we are committed to the equality of all streams in Judaism. But in terms of the reality in Israel, Israelis at this point are familiar with and exposed to the labels of reform and conservative. They're not exposed to the labels of Reconstructionist or renewal. May change depending on the movements and their level of investment in Israel, but that's what's behind it. Not an exclusion of Reconstructionist and renewal, but rather a question that makes sense, or more sense, to the sample that is asked. Now, when we look at the further breakdown of the views on this issue, what we see is that 88% of the secular and 75% of the traditional not so religious are in support of equal rights for the three major streams. And similarly, in terms of the political breakdown, it's very interesting to see only the right and very right are supporting equality on a less than 50% level. Center right, center, and center left and left are all clearly based on a majority that supports equal rights to all the streams. Now, this has been the case, and as I said, we have been asking this question from the beginning in 2009, and as you can see, it's pretty consistent. Already back in 2009, 63% supported it, and this continues further. Now, look at the left side, two columns. Support for equal rights for the streams also enjoys a majority of Likud voters. 60% of Likud voters say, yes, I support equal rights to the streams. Now, this again is something that you will see repeating on many issues, namely, when the Likud supports policies that are discriminatory against the non-Orthodox streams, they are not doing it because this is somehow ideologically mandated, not because their constituency supports it, but because it is politically prudent, so long as they put their eggs in the ultra-Orthodox basket. And of course, one of the differences between the Likud and blue and white is the overwhelming majority, 91% of those who voted for blue and white in the March 2020 elections are saying equal rights to the streams is what we support. And now, of course, the next question, which is very practical, is, well, should diaspora Jewry get involved? And we asked that question again and again. And some of you may be familiar with studies that were done on this question. And previous studies and parallel studies have shown to a great degree that Israelis are ambivalent, and some will say ambivalent at best, about should the Israeli government, should the diaspora Jewry, should the Israeli government take into consideration the views of diaspora Jewry, and should diaspora Jewry get into this battlefield? This is true regarding security, this is true regarding territories, this is true regarding the peace process, etc. And in sort of theory, in abstract, it raises very interesting questions about the relationship between our two communities. But please understand, to a great degree, the question is, what are you really asking me about? Put aside the abstract question. If we ask the question, do you support diaspora Jewish involvement, engagement of Jewish organizations in strengthening freedom of religion and pluralism in Israel? And in the question we ask specifically, such as freedom of choice in marriage, ending the chief rabbinate's monopoly on matters of conversion and others, what you see is a clear 64%, again, the same 2/3, 64% who say, yes, we welcome, we support, we embrace diaspora Jewish involvement in something that we feel we need all the help we can get on, because we are really, have a shared interest here. And that shared interest is the interest in advancing the state of Israel, but also advancing world Jewry, Jewish peoplehood, and the link, the bond between the two. So as you will see, consistently, this is 2017, 2019, 2020, what you see is more or less the same with growth from 2017. 2017, it was 55%. And then it grew slightly to 66%, 63%. Obviously, the differences here between 66 and 63 have more to do with the margin of error in sampling than with a change of position. So consistently and growingly, the majority of the Israeli public supports that. And when you look at the breakdown in terms of religious identity, again, what you see is both traditional groups, the not religious and the leaning toward religious, have a majority that supports it, and especially the secular, as 85% of the Israeli secular Jews, which is the largest group in Israel, say, bring it on. Now, another question that has risen more sharply this year, and now I haven't, my wife, Gary, has not broken in, and I assume that that is because you haven't been asking questions or making comments. So if you do want to have these issues, other issues expanded on, explained, challenged, please use the chat, and I'll welcome that very much. In any case.
There are some questions, but I think that they are not relating to topics that you may want to get into a discussion on at the moment.
Well, that's when you have your wife moderating the, monitoring the questions. There's, discretion used as well. But I'll be looking at the questions, even those that don't address these specific issues of religion and state and how Israelis feel about it later, and we'll see if I can respond to you directly or somehow. Anyway, a very interesting, important question that arose in Israel in the course of last year, but of course is an age-old question. Who is a Jew? But not just who is a Jew in terms of the battle over conversion, but who is a Jew in terms of the Russian Olim whose mother is not Jewish. And earlier in the year, the beginning of the year, the chief rabbi, in a what he thought was a private meeting with rabbis from all over the country who were designated to travel and serve diaspora communities, made some outrageous, outlandish statements about the Russian Olim. And I won't go into the details. I'll be very glad to share with you things that we have written about it and some further background information. But the point is, it raised once again the question of whom are we willing to consider as Jewish? And immediately following that, there was an attempt once again at the Knesset to change the law of return and deal with what's usually referred to as the grandfather clause, namely the law of return grants the right of Aliyah not only to Jews, but to spouses of Jews and children of Jews and grandchildren of Jews. And of course, primarily those who belong to the categories of, ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox are not happy. Because as far as they're concerned, the ideal is for Israel to be a Torah state. And in a Torah state, it's the chief rabbinate that calls the shots. It's the chief rabbinate that decides, or those on the right of the chief rabbinate, that decide who is genuinely Jewish and who is not. So at this point, the attempts to pass that legislation have been successfully held off, but it's pending. The one who is most associated with these efforts is Knesset member Smotrich from Yamina, who was in the previous government, was the Minister of Transport, and he is not giving up. And he has quite a number of supporters in the ultra-Orthodox and related religious groups. So we asked the question, basically looking at the reality that is presented by the Russian Olim, and in terms of the population registry, there are about 400,000 who are registered in the population registry as others. What a terrible label for the Ministry of the Interior, governed by Shas, the ultra-Orthodox Sephardic party, to use for those new immigrants who came to Israel under the law of return, but gained the right of Aliyah because their father or their grandfather was Jewish, but not their mother. So they are labeled others. And the question is, how do Israelis view those others that may have a Jewish father and non-Jewish mother, and of course patrilineal descent comes to mind, and identify as Jews? So we asked that question. We asked it in December of 2019, and we asked it again in this survey, which was done a couple months ago. And we gave three options. Should these born to a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother who identify as Jews be recognized as Jews if they identify as Jews without religious conversion? Should they be recognized as Jews if they undergo religious conversion, whether Orthodox, Conservative, or Reform? And again, my apologies to my good Reconstructionist and renewal friends. It's just that this is not still in the vocabulary of the average Israeli. Or should they be recognized as Jewish only if they undergo conversion recognized by the chief rabbinate? And the results are fascinating, because basically what you see is that only 34%, namely a third, are saying conversion by the chief rabbinate should be a prerequisite for Israel to recognize them as Jewish, or for me to recognize them as Jewish. And that has even gone down slightly from the December 2019 that had 38% say so. And at the same time, what you see is a growth of the percentage on both other options, from 28 to 30 and from 34 to 36, of those who say, I'm open to any conversion that's appropriate and acceptable by the streams in Judaism, of the Jewish world, or significant percentage, again, a third, who are saying, as far as I'm concerned, I'm willing to accept, so long as they identify as Jewish, I'm willing to accept a child of either a Jewish father or a Jewish mother. Now, clearly, this is enough, we believe, to open up the question again and have an honest and open dialogue about that, because maintaining answers that may have been appropriate in the past, but mind you, You have 400,000 and many, children born into this category of those who are not Jewish according to the current definition in the Israeli civil law, not just religious law, civil law. But many Israelis are challenging that. The majority of Israeli Jews are challenging that and are willing to settle for either accepting them as they are or accepting them if they undergo any form of conversion. And that clearly is something that goes to the existential issues facing the state of Israel. Now, it's interesting because, again, when you look at the breakdown in terms of religious identity, what you find is that 57% of the secular are saying, as far as I'm concerned, born to a Jewish father, you identify as Jewish, that's good enough. And the other interesting thing is that even those who are traditional link toward religious, less than half say it should be the chief rabbinate's stamp of approval on the conversion. So clearly the current policies do not reflect where the people are. Well, I have a few other breakdowns politically, and again, it's very interesting because only about half of the Yamina voters, those who intend to vote Yamina, are saying chief rabbinate is necessary. So clearly, again, you see that this is not a party that should be identified with established orthodoxy. It's a party that is identified by its right-wing political leanings, but is a mixture in terms of their views on religion. You look at black and white, only 11% say the chief rabbinate is important. And interestingly, again, look at the undecided. The undecided as well, 46%, almost half are saying I'm willing to accept that person as a Jew, regardless of conversion.
We have a couple of questions here. Hold on.
Sure.
When you're talking about how many Jews live in Israel, does it include any of those 400,000 others?
Well, first of all, I did not relate to a number of Jews living in Israel, but no, in terms of the Central Bureau of Statistics, the Jews, those who are registered as Jews and are regarded as Jews for civil purposes, are those that conform to the definition, the current definition in both the population registry law and the law of return. Namely, a Jew is a person born to a Jewish mother or has been converted and is not a member of another religion. So those who were converted, Orthodox or non-Orthodox, qualify as Jews by the civil definition, but those that are patrilineal Jews do not.
There's another question that deals with the chief rabbinate. Does any consensus exist in any sectors of the survey to remove any or all of the chief rabbinate's monopoly in one or more of the areas of burial, marriage, kashrut, or personal status?
Well, actually, I didn't include the question in the presentation that I was hoping to be able to share with you, but I see the time is running and we probably won't be able to finish even the selection that I prepared. But one of the questions that we asked, of course, has to do with conversion. And you see the figures here, namely only about a third say that the chief rabbinate's conversion is what should be deciding the question of Jewish status. But we also asked the question of kashrut. And we asked the question of, because this is a contemporary, very relevant battle in Israel, namely, should it be that, like in the States, kashrut certification can be granted by any body that specializes in kashrut, so long as there is disclosure. People should be able to buy or eat whatever they believe is sufficiently kosher for their criteria. Or, as the current law in Israel requires, namely, you cannot advertise a restaurant, a product, a food product as kosher unless the chief rabbinate, you can't import a food product from overseas and sell it as kosher unless the chief rabbinate puts its stamp of approval on it. By the way, analysis has shown that this costs the Israeli economy hundreds of millions of shekels every year. Just the monopoly, not the supervision, but the monopoly adds on a price tag of hundreds of millions of shekels to the food every year, and of course hikes up the price. But and I don't remember the numbers offhand, you'll be able to see them in the index. Only a minority says, I'm going to eat only in a place that's certified as kosher by the chief rabbinate. A significant percentage, including those who define themselves as Orthodox, are saying, I'll eat at a place that's certified as kosher by any other authority, not just the chief rabbinate. And some are saying, especially secular Israeli Jews, are saying, I couldn't care less. Any other questions?
There are some questions that deal with political parties and security, but I'm not sure you want to go into those at the moment. The one other question about the others, if they're not included as Jews, how do they fit in when you hear that Israel has 8 million people, 6.3 million are Jews and 1.7 million are Arabs?
Well, I will have to refresh my memory looking at the Central Bureau of Statistics reports. Their reports usually designate the 400,000 as others. And I don't really remember where exactly they put them when those overall numbers are being publicized. All right, so let's look at just a few more data pieces. One is, again, political. So for most of the years of the state, the position of the political powers that be, by the way, be they left, center, or right, it's not just a matter of the right, supported having the ultra-Orthodox parties, the Haredi parties, as an integral part and a sort of building block, a necessary building block of their coalition government. And of course, I'm sure all of you are aware of it. You know, no one party has gotten a majority of the votes, and therefore forming a coalition was a sine qua non and getting support of other parties to get a majority and be able to rule. So the Haredi parties have been a likely partner for most of the years of the state, with some exceptions, especially because the statement that is associated with them, for instance, more recently voiced by Rabbi Litzman, who is one of the leaders of Aguda, is the sort of representative of the Ger Rabbi, the large Hasidic dynasty, was we in the coalition are expected to support all kinds of issues that we have no interest in, such as international relations, such as security, such as the economy. But we expect that the things that we have an interest in be responded to and accepted by our partners. And that, of course, is exempting our yeshiva students from military service and leaving us alone when it comes to core curriculum and funding our institutions, etc., etc. So that has become sort of part of the political elements. But the reality is, it is upsetting, it is repulsive to the clear majority of Israelis, including those who vote for some of the coalition parties. So the general question of, what do you believe should be the makeup of the coalition? Should the ultra-Orthodox parties be part of the coalition, or sometimes we pose the question is, should they be in a position of dictating issues of religious life in Israel? Again, the 2/3 majority oppose it. Now, what's important to see is And here you see that only 38% of the Likud voters oppose it. But that is to a great degree because this has become so palpably clear that without the support of the Haredi parties, the Likud is not going to be able to hold on to its dominance. But when you see at the views of the other parts of the population, even Yamina, 57% say, I oppose. Among the undecided, 74% don't want the ultra-Orthodox parties to be part of a government coalition. So what do they want? Our studies over the course of the last 2 years, before the 3 election cycles and after the elections, etc., have consistently shown what the clear majority of Israelis want is a wide unity civil government, namely a government that's based on collaboration between the Likud and Kahol Lavan in the past, when it was larger and a contender for power, clearly with openness to Israel Beitenu, Lieberman's party, but basically a civil unity government. And again, bear in mind, the clear majority of Israelis place themselves on the right of center. So to say that what they are supporting is a civil government that consists of Likud, of blue and white, of Israel Beitenu, and possibly some others, is understandable. This isn't about the extreme left joining with the extreme right. This is about the center. So blue and white voters will say, 85% will say no. 91% of Yesh Atid voters will say no. As you can see, only the very right and right are saying a majority supports having the Haredi parties in the coalition. Center leaning to the right, center, and center leaning to the left and left all have a clear majority saying keep them out of the coalition or keep them out from being able to dictate the government policies. Okay, I think that we'll continue with just 1 or 2 additional points and then we'll call it a day. So one important question for our diaspora, our North American and other allies to understand.
Before you get to that, Uri,
yes.
There's a question about whether political leaders from the various parties are being given this survey, and if so, do they express their thoughts on it?
Well, we have just come out with a survey, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah. We sent it out to all the relevant Knesset members, and we certainly hope to engage in dialogue with at least some of them who are, more relevant for such a dialogue. So we asked the question, what do you hold to be the most important issues that the party that you support should be pushing in their Knesset, in their political work? And we included in the list a number of things, including the 2 issues that are so prominent in the American Jewish dialogue and the discourse on these issues, namely equal recognition for the non-Orthodox denominations in Israel and permitting women of the wall and egalitarian prayer groups to hold services and read from Torah at the Kotel. Now, please understand, and I've alluded to it before, there is a majority support for both, namely equal recognition and, we didn't include it in this survey, but we did it in the past, for egalitarian services and women of the wall. Majority support them. But we need to make a distinction between support and is it important to them? And the reality is it's the least important among the issues involving the clash of religion and state. And if we don't understand that, we may find ourselves, banging our head against the wall, and it's not the most effective implementation of our potential for advocacy and bringing about change. Again, not that it's not supported. It's just that there are other things that matter much more to the average Israelis. Now, the good news is that among those options, we included the option of none of these is important to me. And only 17% are saying none of that is important to me. So yes, the clear majority of Israelis find these issues of the clash of religion and state to be of interest, but not all are enjoying the same level of importance. The top three issues are the general principle of freedom of religion and equality of civic burden in general, public transportation on Shabbat, and recognizing civil marriage and divorce. And we don't have time to go into more details at this point, but I'm just suggesting that, A, it's a very serious reply to the question, because as you can see, there is a difference between the way that people respond to public transportation on Shabbat and the way people respond to the question of opening business, mini markets and businesses on Shabbat. Whereas public transportation is viewed as, one of the most important issues, or most important issues by 31%, opening mini markets and businesses on Shabbat only 16%. So people make a distinction. It's not as if they want the Sabbath to be turned into just any other day of the week. That's not the case. And they make a distinction. But when we look at what areas are areas that we share in common, I suggest that recognizing civil marriage and divorce, or basically freedom of marriage, is indeed that main issue where we share an interest in the North American and diaspora Jewish community. That aspect of freedom of marriage is closely associated with who is a Jew, because those who are not recognized as Jews by the chief rabbinate can't marry in Israel. So the majority of the children growing up in the Jewish community in the US now would not be eligible to legally marry in Israel. It's a horrendous thought in terms of thinking of what is our unity, what our bonds are going to be based on in the next generation. It's a terrible, terrible prognosis, because, people feeling that they are not going to be treated as equals, as fully fledged potential citizens of the state of Israel, not a great, incentive to be committed to support our joint enterprise called the State of Israel. So for diaspora Jews, the right to marry, the right to family is associated directly with who is a Jew. And the struggle for who is a Jew that stopped at granting civil recognition for those that converted non-Orthodox, and at this point modern Orthodox, which the chief rabbinate doesn't recognize either. We stopped too short, because those very individuals for whom we fought and are now eligible to make Aliyah, receive Israeli citizenship, and quite a number of them are doing that, then find themselves as second-class citizens. That is something that clearly is important to Israelis and should be important to American Jews, not just because of the Jews by choice, but because of those who want to marry religiously by Reform or conservative rabbis. The Russian Olim, those 400,000 that I mentioned that came to Israel due to support, active support, dramatic support by many world Jewish leaders, and especially in North America, none of them can marry in Israel. They're all Israeli citizens. None of them can marry in Israel, can't marry legally. they can go back to Russia and marry and then return to Israel, or go to Cyprus and return to Israel. Hardly an acceptable solution. So what I'm saying is, it's not that fighting for women of the wall or egalitarian services is wrong. It's right. It's justified. It's moral. It's religiously sound. But in terms of moving the needle in the public battle over religious freedom and equality in Israel, coming together to fight for that which we share an interest in, such as the right to family, is a much more strategically and tactically sound option. All right, there is quite a bit more, we'll see. I mean, you will certainly receive the link to this survey afterwards, and there are quite a number of issues that I didn't get to. Let me just see. Well, this is an interesting political analysis, sub-analysis that we did, namely those in the next elections. And Israel Beitenu, Lieberman's party, certainly demonstrated that by moving from the September 2019, the April 2019 elections to the September 2019 elections, they shifted gears and placed the issue of religious freedom as the cornerstone of their campaign, which resulted in rising from 5 seats to 8 seats. And clearly demonstrating something that I have a difficult time convincing many of the people that I speak with overseas, that the issues of religion and state have a potential for truly affecting the outcome of the elections in Israel. And we should not underplay their importance. Now, we did hear over, as I said, we surveyed this question of, if a party that meets your general political outlook were to commit actively to pursue religious freedom and equality, is that going to result with a greater likelihood that you'll vote for it, lesser likelihood that you'll vote for it, or won't make a difference? And what you see is, we asked that in 2017 and 2018 and 2019, and now in these in the index survey, is the delta is consistent, namely you stand to gain significant percentage of support if you took a strong stand in support of religious freedom and equality. All right. Well, maybe the last, that's the last item that I will mention at this time, and that is, as I said, the right to family, the right to marry. Whereas currently the only form of legal marriage recognized in Israel is religious marriage, through the chief rabbinate for Jews and through the religious establishments of the other recognized religious communities. There is no civil marriage, as you know, for anyone, Jews and non-Jews alike. So when we pose the question, do you support Israel recognizing equally civil marriage and marriage by Orthodox, conservative, or Reform, we get again a consistent 2/3 support for freedom of religion and equal recognition of all forms of Judaism. And as you can see, even 55% of the Likud voters are saying, yes, we support equal recognition of all forms of marriage. Okay, a lot more can be said about those issues. Gary, is there anything else we should be looking at before we close? And I'll mention, maybe before you tell me, I'll just mention that the upcoming webinar is not only of great interest, but also of great importance. And it's going to interest both those with Jewish interests and those with legal interests. We'll be hosting Dr. Susan Weiss, a well-known, highly impactful lawyer, modern Orthodox, who has been a feminist activist heading an organization called the Women's Justice Center, fighting in the Supreme Court and the rabbinic courts, and she will be bringing sort of an expert's evidence from the battlefield as to a current case in the Supreme Court and related issues, a current case in the Supreme Court where the rabbinic courts pulled the rug from under the Jewish status of 3 generations of a family that made Aliyah from the former Soviet Union. A horrible thing to do, and not only to this family, but the indication that basically, you may think that you're Jewish, but think again, because the rabbinic courts can undo your Jewish status at any point, even decades after you have been recognized, after the rabbinate searched into your genealogy, into your status, and confirmed that you were Jewish. They can undo that at the future date. So issues involving mamzerim, illegitimacy, issues involving agunot, the chained women, issues involving Jewish status of olim and olot are going to be discussed by Dr. Susan Weiss, September 19th at noon, New York time. I hope that you and others will be with us. So Gary, is there anything else?
Is that perhaps October 19th?
October 19th.
September 19th already passed, so.
Yes, definitely, October 19th.
So people are thanking you for all of your information, and that they think that you might need to do another webinar to get in more of this information. And people are trying to get you to connect the security issues to the issues of religion and state. And so you'll have to go through and see what they have been asking about and perhaps deal with that at a later time.
Now, I will remiss if I don't say something that we have discussed amongst us. We love holding these webinars, and we feel that we are rewarded by your interest and coming back to hear them. Some of you have been supporting us for a number of years now. We would very much appreciate support by those who can to expand the scope of these webinars, because we don't advertise them because we don't have the funds to advertise them. We would like to be able to sort of step up the awareness and the distribution and the marketing of these webinars, and possibly even include a few elements that may involve an expense. So if you care, if you can, please support the webinar initiative. And I assume that Gordon Silverman has put an address there, and you can write me when you get the follow-up email. We would very much appreciate it, and are committed to and will be stepping up our outreach with your help. So again, Shana Tova, Chag Sameach, and Gmar Tov.
You'll see.
Or you should add, it's very easy to make a contribution online with a credit card too. Go to your website.
Thank you. Chidush.org, HIDDUSH.org, and there you can just with a click of the mouse get to PayPal account and make your contribution using your credit card. And yes, Ron, thank you. And thank you for your support.
501c3?
Sorry? Yes, Chidush is a 501c3 organization, and we'll send the IRS confirmation to anyone who is interested.
Right. You'll see my address on the chat, and I'm going to put in my email address as well.
Very good. Thank you all. Chag Sameach, Shana Tova, Gmar Tov, and I look forward to seeing you all on October 19th. And thank our partners at J-Plan, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network. Thank you. Shalom and Shana Tova.